Most everybody has heard of Captain John Smith, the swashbuckling Turk-killing adventurer who was Pocahontas's lover boy, as well as one of the founders of the colony of Jamestown. But what most people don't know is that the tough living conditions of the settlement forced him to travel up the coast in search of both better land and hopefully goldfields. What he found instead was the New England coastline, teeming with cod, which he proceeded to catch and salt, returning to England with holds full of fish and selling the haul on the European market, which made him an absolute fortune. Smith's widely circulated account in 1616 of plentiful cod off the coast of Maine was incentive enough for the Pilgrims to make a go of it, and is the reason they chose Plymouth rather than the more southerly Jamestown as their landing site. But the Holy Rollers had little experience in either fishing or farming and almost starved to death until Native Americans came to their rescue. The irony was that at the very same time, dozens of English ships were some way offshore pulling in fish as big as men. Quick learners with a strong Protestant work ethic, they eventually got the hang of it, and within a couple of decades, the New England townships that sprang up in their wake were becoming prosperous cod fishing communities. Salem, a town now noted for its brutal witch trials, was at the time actually a lucrative cod fishing hub. In fact, by 1640, the Massachusetts Bay Colony was contributing 300,000 salted cod annually to the European market. The milder weather, ice-free harbours and the plentiful local arable land meant that New England developed an all-year-round fishing industry and a continuously inhabited local infrastructure, compared to the Canadian fishing grounds off Newfoundland, which were limited to seasonal fishing and hence a much slower pace of development. The English soon found themselves outcompeting their French neighbours to the north, who now found it expedient to sell their catch to the New Englanders rather than waste time processing it themselves in a climate where time and daylight was of the essence. In return, they bought farm tools, cattle and equipment, and the English-speaking cities that soon arose, such as Boston, boomed as a result. New Englanders developed an entrepreneurial business culture that spanned the entire length of the American coastline, living entirely independently of British oversight, and, more importantly, meddling. Adam Smith, when writing his seminal treatise on economics, The Wealth of Nations, singled out New England as an example of the prosperity that could be achieved through unrestricted capitalism. By the mid-17th century, New England had become such a major player in the international cod trade that the fish was depicted in a myriad of official seals and documents, and generations of fishing families had established what's come to be known as the codfish aristocracy, with numerous mansions being decorated with stylized fish motifs. We know that there was even a gilded cod hanging from the ceiling of the Boston Town Hall, as well as other government assembly buildings. In the burgeoning coastal cities of North America, cash, as they say, was king, and cod was cash. By now, salted American cod accounted for an astonishing 60% of all the fish eaten in Europe. But it wasn't just poor Mediterranean housewives and fancy French chefs who were making the most of the influx of the cheap but delectable fish. Nor was cod, by any means, the only profitable industry to emerge throughout the New World. But cod played a significant role in their facilitation. You see, by the 1700s, the sugarcane industry was also big business, and the numerous Caribbean islands that produced it had developed their own molasses aristocracies, just like the cod snobs up north. Sugar production was a hugely labour-intensive process, and like the cotton and tobacco plantations, to keep costs low, it relied on the labour of hundreds of thousands of imported slaves, who worked sometimes 16 hours a day in the searing heat, day in and day out, till they died. These people had to be fed, but the arable land required for food crops would have eaten into valuable sugarcane land. Initially, they were fed salted beef all the way from Britain, but when New England's salted cod market took off, cod barons quickly found a new market for the fish that was not quite up to export standard. Super cheap second-rate bacalhau was sold to plantation owners at a discount price, and indeed some producers turned entirely to exporting low-salt, poor-quality fish entirely geared for the West Indies marketplace. When the French ceded Newfoundland to the English in the Treaty of Utrecht in 1713, the industry accelerated with gusto. The cod cities of northeastern America were now trading cheap fish to English, French and Dutch Caribbean sugar barons, from which they acquired salt, sugar, cotton and tobacco. They were likewise trading their premium cod direct to the Europeans in return for wine, iron, coal and fancy European status symbols like china, textiles and fashion items. As Americans increasingly engaged in trade with the outside world, they came to resent any kind of interference in their commercial arrangements. The British back in the motherland knew there was trouble brewing, and when they eventually won the 7 Years' War with France, there was much discussion over what the spoils of war should be. Do they let the French keep Canada and their remaining cod fisheries, or do they take Guadeloupe, or one of the other lucrative French Caribbean sugar islands that made more money than all the British ones combined? In the end, the Brits were getting so nervous about losing their American colonies to mutiny that they opted to forego the sugar income and expand their holdings in the north of America instead. Kurlansky notes that in allowing the French to keep their slave islands but deny them their Canadian fisheries, they were actually accelerating the descent into war with their own 13 colonies. You see, one of the fundamental laws governing commerce within the British Empire were the so-called Acts of Trade and Navigation. Under this law, all colonial outposts were required to sell their export goods to England and also buy their imported goods from England. In other words, they were supposed to sell their cod to England and then buy their Caribbean sugar, salt, Spanish iron, coal, and French wine and textiles from Mother England and nowhere else. You can just imagine the customs and tax revenue this would provide for His Majesty's government without even lifting a finger. Not surprisingly, Americans took a dim view of this law and completely ignored it. Nobody likes a middleman, so they decided American cash was staying firmly in America, and the cod export revenues from their direct trade to international partners was being used to build factories that converted cheap imported Caribbean molasses into rum. Cod was fueling not only a boom in the slave market, but now also the booze industry. In West Africa, there were 3 ways you could purchase slaves: with cash, salted cod, or Boston rum. The French sugar plantations needed New England cod, and the Boston rum industry needed French molasses. After a century of unimpeded trade, the big boys in London finally decided it was time to rein in these insolent colonial rascals, so they imposed a molasses import duty, which was aimed at crippling both the production of rum and the export of cod. It did neither, and the burgeoning contraband trade in cod for molasses actually increased after the introduction of the Molasses Act of 1733. A few years later, they upped the ante and hiked the taxes even more, now also taxing the import of Madeira. The Americans retaliated by boycotting British goods altogether and smuggling both sugar and Madeira on the black market on an even greater scale. Once again, The British responded, this time with a new tactic, levying a direct tax on the population they called the Stamp Act, rather than trying to police the widely flaunted customs duty. Other general taxes soon followed. Things were getting grim, and nobody was backing down. Kurlansky writes that the revolution that followed was not a cultural one or a romantic social experiment, such as many that both preceded and followed the American War of Independence. It was instigated by middle-class Protestant entrepreneurs furious at outsiders meddling in their business. They weren't interested in rectifying class disputes, minority ethnic tensions, or social engineering. To them, it was just business, pure and simple. As the situation hotted up, the British first tried to starve out the colonists by blocking their harbours and patrolling the fishing grounds. But this wasn't 1620. The colonists had by now plenty of food, plenty of booze, and a new homegrown style of ship called the schooner that could outrun pretty much any British warship. Even when fitted with dodgy cannons, American schooners were running rings around British patrol ships, with hundreds of them being captured and added to the fledgling American naval fleet. In the end, the British decided it just wasn't worth it.